Hey, today we're going to be talking about lexical scope and this. Now, this is the JavaScript keyword this. And the point of the video is really to try and help you understand how this works. I want to help you avoid errors and pitfalls that are based on understandable but erroneous assumptions about what this means. So we're going to go through this list down here at the bottom. I have some code here. At the very end of this, we're going to get into event listeners in the browser and talk about how this works with those. But we're going to go through the list here. We're going to talk about the new keyword, how that impacts this, what explicit binding is, what implicit binding is, how useStrict impacts this, what default binding is, and then how arrow functions use lexical scope and how they're attached to the keyword this, or how they force the keyword this to be interpreted. And then finally, we'll get into event listeners. Now, this list that you see here, at least the first 6 items here, this is sort of the list that the browser goes through. When it sees the keyword this, it's sort of running through this list to figure out how it is supposed to interpret this. So we're going to talk about each of these, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll be an expert in understanding this. You'll be able to explain it to other people and then really understand it better yourself. All right, so we're going to ignore this bit of code. We'll talk about this at the very end, the stuff down at the bottom here. New. Let's talk about the new keyword first of all. So I'm going to create a function here. I'm just going to call it f. Now I can write it this way with the variable declaration, or we could write it as this, like that. Either way, it's going to do the same thing. So whether it's the function declaration or the function expression, it works the same way as it pertains to this. So inside of here, I'm going to write out what this is. Now, if I call this function, so save that, we'll run this in the browser, and here it is. That's what this is. It's the window object in the browser. If you're running this through Node.js, you're going to get the global object. There is an object actually called global, which is the global object. In the browser, you're going to get window as the result of this. That is because inside of here, we're actually jumping down through all these things. We're getting down to the default binding, and we're looking here at the keyword this. The browser looks at this, or the JavaScript interpreter looks at this and says, okay, what is the context for running this function right here? And that is the window object. You can see right here, we're in the global scope calling this function. So the window object is the global scope, effectively, and that's what this is going to be. Now, if I, didn't mean to erase that, if I say new f, like that, I'm using the new keyword to turn this function into a constructor function. When we do that, we are turning this into the object that is being constructed by this function. That's why it's called a constructor. It's constructing an object. And there it is. It's an object of type f. There's my whole function. So we have an object being created that is going to be returned. Now I haven't put the return keyword in here. If I was to do something like that, so let's just call it f_obj. There we go. And we can see the thing that was returned from the function, that is the object of type f. So this thing is a constructor. It built an object. And if you use this inside of the function and you call it with the new keyword, you're turning that function into a constructor, and it will return this. This is the new object that's being returned. All right, great. So that is the first one down. Pretty simple. If you see new, this is going to be the object returned by that function. Okay, next one, explicit binding with call, apply, or bind. Now, all 3 of these functions, call, apply, and bind, are doing the same sort of thing. Call and apply, the only difference between the 2 of them is with call, my first argument for doing that is going to be the context, and then everything else is going to be a list of arguments I'm passing to the function. With apply, you pass in the context, and then you pass an array. So there's only 2 arguments. So call, we get the context followed by argument, just like that. With apply, you pass in the context, and then we pass in an array of things like this. So that's the difference between call and apply. Bind works the same way as call, except it returns a copy of the function. So bind, same as call. All right, so those are definitions of what we're doing. How do they work, and what does it have to do with this? We have our function here, f. Okay, I'm going to create, I'm going to use that function. I'm going to say f, I'm going to call it, and now I am explicitly going to tell it what is the context for that function to run. Here, f, the context was the global scope, the window object. So if I put window here, I'm passing in the window object as the context for calling this thing. If I pass in null, I'm saying there is no context for calling that. If I call this with null, basically I'm saying I'm not giving you context. We're kind of jumping ahead to the use strict and what's going to happen there. This is going to write out the window object again in the browser. We'll come back to that one though. Or if I have some object, so let's say here that I'm going to create an object. I'll create an object x, x for explicit, and I will give it one property, a1. Actually, let's make a copy of this function here as well so we can make changes to it. Let's call this fx for function explicit. So here's my first object, object x. I'll make another one so we can play with both of these. And obj x. There we go. That is the context now. So what I'm doing is I'm calling this function right here, and inside of here I'm saying I want to use this thing as the context. This points to the context, so this will be this object x. There it is, there's object x. If I change this to object x2, that's this one. There it is. We've jumped to the second one. So we can specify anything that we want as the context for doing this. If I say window, window is the context. If I use the document object is the context for calling that function. So whatever I pass in here, that will become this inside of that function, as long as it's not an arrow function. And we'll come back to those. Everything else that we passed, like I said here in the definition, if I passed in the numbers 1 and 2, up here, there we go, there's A and B, that will be the 1 and that'll be the 2. And this dot A, if I go back to one of those two objects here, obj x, so my AB, that's going to be the 1, 2. This dot A, well, if obj x is my context, what is the value of A inside of objects? Well, it's this A1. So I should get A1 back. There we go. There's the 1, 2, and there's the A1. All right, so that's explicit binding. So we've got the constructor function, we've got explicit binding, and just as a quick demonstration for bind, I can say let f2 equal, there we go. What I'm doing here with, oh sorry, not called bind, this is the example with bind. I'm going to run the function fex, so this function is going to run. I'm passing in this as the context right here, this obj ex. Now I don't have to pass these in right here, I can pass them in later. What I'm going to get back from this is a copy of this function where obj.ex2 is the context. So obj.ex2, this is now a copy of that function. If I run it, like this, and then we pass in the 4 and 5. There we go. We have a copy of the function fex, but in this copy, it is understood that obj.ex2 will be the context for this. There it is. There's the 4, 5, and the a2. So this is the second time running. If we comment out this one, there it is. So 4, 5, that's what we passed in here. And obj.ex2 gives us that second object. So there's the property A inside of there. Okay, so that's explicit binding. Now, implicit binding. This is the one that gets a little bit more confusing for some people. So with implicit binding, what we are doing is we're telling the function, okay, I need you to look and see what the context was for calling you. I haven't told you outright, you're going to have to look and check. So we will say, I'm going to comment this one out. We're going to create a new one here for the implicit. All right, so I've created an object here, property A and a property F. The F property is a function. Now, this is sort of the new shorthand syntax for writing methods inside of objects. We can also do this. We can say that F is a function. These two syntaxes are the exact same thing. Here, I'll throw another one in there just so you've got the two of them. You can look at them side by side. There we go. So F and G, exact same thing. Regular functions, they handle this the exact same way. I'm not using arrow functions here because arrow functions will change the context, and we'll come back and talk about that. But here's our object. And now what I want to do is I want to start calling these functions. If I was to say obj.f, what I'm doing here is I'm calling this function f, this one. So I'm calling that function, and the context for calling this points to the context. The context is going to be here, this object. This is the thing. This is the context, this object. So my function, what is the value of this right here? Well, it's this object. So that first one, obj. This one right here, what I'm doing is I'm creating a new reference. This F3 is pointing to this. So we go to the object. We find the thing called F. What is it? It's this function right here. So F3 is now a pointer that goes directly to this. If I call F3, I'm talking about the global context here. F3 is not inside obj. F3 is just a thing on its own. It's just a direct reference to that function. So we're going to get that window object. There it is. So here's the first one. Here's our obj, which is the whole thing. This whole thing right here, this is obj. So when we said obj.f, we're calling the function and we're providing a context right here, the thing that's in front of the method name. For the second one, because I pointed directly to this, what I've done is I've kind of skipped over the fact that this is an obj. I've just pointed directly to this thing right here. Well, if I just run this on its own, like I have here, its context is now this global context. It's the window object. Okay, so I'll give you an example here of where you could go wrong if you're not quite sure of what the context is going to be. So let's create a function here. I'm going to create a function that's going to be like a counter. I'll say this.count, and we'll increment it. So every time we call it, I want to increment a property called count on this. Now, this depends on the context. You look at this code, and logically, you might think that this is talking about the function because that's where you wrote it. And that's where the lexical scope comes into play. Lexical scope, lexing, is a process that happens when JavaScript runs. It's actually passed through the interpreter a couple of times. The first time is the lexing, or the tokenization, where it reads through your code and it figures out where are all the variables, where are all the references to the different elements, and what is the scope right here as it's written. That is called lexical scope. So where you've written something right here, so this property A, its scope is inside of the object obj. Okay, that's lexical scope. This uses a different scope. It doesn't use lexical scope. In regular functions, you have to put this inside of a function. You can't just write this on the main timeline. When I write this, the lexical scope says, okay, where is this function? What is its scope? That's what my this is going to be, my context for this. Arrow functions are going to use the lexical scope, and we'll come back and talk about that. But everything else beyond this uses the lexical scope. So A is inside of obj. The context for A is obj. Functions, when you're using this, you're talking about runtime, not read time. So not when it's being tokenized, not when it's being lexed. The lexical scope doesn't apply to this inside of regular functions, or even the ES5 shorthand version of the functions. So here, in this function where I'm adding one, it looks like it because everything else in JavaScript, you're talking about lexical scope. So it looks like you're writing a property on this object right here, this function object. So you can say to yourself, well, okay, what if I give a starting value of count as 0? Thinking, oh yeah, okay, I've got a property count. It's on the function add1. I'm setting it to 0. And that is exactly what this line does. Here's the context. Here's a brand new property. Functions in JavaScript are just objects. So I've got an object called add1. I've just created a property called count on that object, and I've set it to 0. Here, it all depends on the context when it runs. So if I just call add1, and I do this a few times like that, you might read through this and think, oh, okay, yeah, so the value of add1.count at this point is going to be 3. But if we log it out, so say that I'll comment out these other ones. There we go. So I want to see what the value of add1 count is. 0. It says it is 0 because I set it to 0 right here. However, what I was actually doing inside of here was, what's the context for running add1? On these 3 lines right here, the context is the window object. It's that global object. So on the window object, I've got a property called count, and I'm trying to increment that. Because there is no starting value in this, every time I try to increment it, it's taking undefined and it is trying to increment undefined. So I'm going to get not a number as the result here. So this one's coming back as 0. If I say window.count, look at the number for that, I'm going to get not a number. There it is. Had I here said window.count equals, I'll just throw in 8 just to have a different number, now we can see 11. So it was being incremented. This, although at a glance looks like you're talking about the function, this doesn't do that. This uses runtime to determine the scope. Okay, now I'm going to do another example here, just because implicit binding is some of the most challenging to wrap your head around. I'm just going to copy in a bit of sample code here and just talk about the results. So I've got another function where I'm going to write out the value of a. I've got an object 1 where a is 1, object 2 where a is 2, object 3 where a is 3. So I've got the 3 different values. F4 inside of obj1 is a direct reference here to that function. In obj2, what I'm doing is I'm pointing to this first object. So this object inside of it has a property called F4. In number 3, I'm pointing directly to it. So this is a lot like the example that I did up here, where we were talking about the direct reference versus the one with this context. So the window context or the object context. obj1.f4. Okay, obj1, f4. I've provided a context here. obj1 is the context for this. So when I write out this.a, I get the value 1 from inside of obj1. So that is the context, so that's the value. obj2.obj1.f4. obj2, it's at the start of the chain. Looks kind of like it might be the context for the whole thing, but really, we've gone from obj2 down to its obj1 property. And then this right here, this is the context for calling f4. So we're calling this f4. obj1.f4. Well, it's the obj1.f4, which is a reference to that function. That's the one that we're calling. So we get the same binding here, obj1 right next to it. That is the thing that provides the context. Just like here, obj1.f4, obj1.f4. The thing that's right inside, right in front of the function, that is the thing that's giving the context. obj3.f4, because inside of obj3, we made its f4 property a direct reference right here, obj1.f4. So we're pointing to this thing right here, which is a direct reference to f4. We've made this the thing that is in front. So this becomes the value. So the first two, we get 1. They're both using obj1 as the context. And for this one, obj3 is the context. All right, so I hope that makes sense for the implicit binding. Now, the couple of other things that will impact this, one is use strict. If we add use strict, whether it's on the entire file, so up here at the very top, I say use strict, I put my page into strict mode, my script into strict mode, or we can put use strict inside of the function itself. If we do that, we're losing this default binding. This thing that I've been talking about all along about how it points to the window object, that is the default binding, the window object or the global object. If we don't provide a context, like here in this very first one, when I just call that F, that first one, we're saying, oh, okay, yeah, that was the window object. But now with use strict, we're saying don't use default binding. That's that window global binding. It doesn't exist now. So we're actually going to get undefined. Instead of JavaScript saying, oh, okay, yeah, I'll just use the window object. You haven't really explained what the context is, so I'm going to use the global object. So I'm going to comment out my ones down below here that I was running. Just don't want all the other console log statements to come up. There we go. Back up to the top. So when I call F now, undefined. Okay, I'll go down here and turn off or stop these running because that's what's causing the other error. There we go. Undefined. That's the value because we've turned off that default binding with use strict. So use strict turns off the global window object. We don't have that by default, and that's fine. If you're using this, you should understand what you're doing with this. So if I call something with new, or I call something with call or bind or apply, I should understand what it is that I'm doing with that. So there shouldn't be situations where I'm relying on this default behavior. That's what usestrict does, is it tries to teach you that you should intentionally do things in your code. Don't just rely on default behaviors. Okay, arrow functions. Almost to the end here. Arrow functions, as I was saying before, they use lexical scope, and that is the write time scope. Not the read time, but the write time. When it's going through the lexing, when it's going through that tokenization, that first pass where it's looking at where everything is written and determining what the scope is based on where it is written. So if I create a function here and make it an arrow function, there we go. Now I'm going to call this function, and we'll give it a context. Let's just take one of our objects here. Let's say obj1. You would expect, with a regular function, we've done explicit binding, which is number 2 on that list. So with explicit binding, this is going to be obj1. That's what it's going to write out. But with arrow functions, it goes back to that global object. Because with arrow functions, we're looking at where is it written? What is the context where the function was written? So this is inside of this function right here. What is the scope for this function? It's the global object. It's on the global namespace right here. So, therefore, the window object is the scope. And this, even though we've got use strict up above, with arrow functions, we're not doing that default binding. What we're doing is we're using lexical scope to determine this. One other example with this one. Let's use a regular function that returns an arrow function, just to further illustrate this point. So our function will use our A1 object, our obj1 object again. It's got the A property. We'll do that. So here we're calling this function. We're using obj1 as the context. This is going to return another function. Now the one it's returning is an arrow function. So I can call what came back. This function right here gets passed back. Now, because it's an arrow function, we're using lexical scope. With lexical, it means we look at the function and we say, hey, what would the value of this be? What is the context where you were written? Well, in this case, I called f6 with the context obj1. So we've got obj1 being the context. That means when I run x, which is this function, I should get the value of obj1.a, which is, if we look up here, 1. So that's the value that we should get from that. There we are. There is the 1. So that is working. We're getting this obj1 context. The other thing about arrow functions is that, pardon me, they ignore explicit binding. They don't care about any other kind of binding. They've been bound based on where they were written. They use lexical scope. So they care where they were written, what the context was when they were written. If you're using call, like here I'm using call on a regular function, but if I try to do x.call and we say obj2, it doesn't care. It does not care that we've said, I want to use obj2 as the binding. I still get 1. I still get obj1 as the binding, because where this function was written, the binding here, the context here was obj1. So it doesn't matter what I pass in here with call. That's the thing about arrow functions, is they ignore explicit binding. So the obj2 explicit binding is ignored. And one last note about arrow functions. They can't have their value of this changed. They can't have it changed by explicit binding. They cannot be used as constructors. They can't have their binding changed. So this isn't going to work. So you're just going to get a type error. If you try to run them as a constructor function, you're just going to get that type error. Nothing's going to work. All right, so there is, I think we got everything here. We talked about constructors. We talked about explicit binding. We talked about implicit binding and a bunch of permutations of that. Use strict we talked about, the default binding we talked about, arrow functions. We talked about, in the last part, event listeners in the browser. This one's going to be easy now. So down here, what I did was I waited for the DOM content loaded event. I found all the paragraphs inside of main, looped through them, and I added a click handler to each one, which is going to call this function right here. Now, if I do console.log ev.currentTarget, I'm going to get the reference to the paragraph. Here, let me just comment these ones out here so I don't get a whole bunch of console log statements. I think that was all of them. That one right there. Okay. There. So we're empty now. Back down here. So EV current target. This is the paragraph that was clicked. I've got 3 paragraphs on my page. All 3 of them have click listeners. All 3 of them will call this. So if I click on this bottom one, there's paragraph with the ID 3, 2, 1. So every time I call them, I know which paragraph it is that's clicked. This is going to do the same thing. This gives me the context. So add event listener is the method being called. What's the context for calling add event listener? Well, it's this variable right here, p. And what is p? It's this variable. We're looping through all these paragraphs. This represents each paragraph in turn as we're looping through it. So this is going to give me the exact same value as ev.currentTarget. So 1, 2, and 3. And there it is. So that is Lexical Scope. That is the keyword this and all of its permutations. I hope that clears up a lot of questions for you. If you have other questions about this, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.